Greetings once again, everyone. Thank you for your patience this morning. My name's Darren Mitchell, and I'm a member of the New South Wales Battle for Australia Committee, which is the organiser of the event today. And in particular, I'd like to just remark on a number of our special guests. We've got with us present today the President of the Legislative Council, representing the New South Wales Government, Mr John Adjunct. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us. And we understand if you're called away at any point, but thank you for continuing New South Wales Government involvement with the occasion. And of course the Anzac Memorial, which is our host and venue today. We thank staff who have been involved in making this possible for us. And you may know that since the new education centre that we're in was opened, it's been a terrific venue for occasions such as this, as well as the regular commemorative ceremonies that occur in various parts of the memorial itself. Thank you too for the representatives of our armed forces who are here today. So for Matt Pearce representing Army, for Peter Noak from the Air Command, and for Philip Height representing Commander Australian Fleet. Thank you for your presence and representation. We do appreciate the continuing involvement in occasions such as this by the ADF. We've also got representatives of various consulates whose nations were involved in protecting Australia and other lands during the Second World War. And in particular, I'd like to recognise those who are present here today from the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the United States. And also we have a very special guest speaker today, Dr John Edwards, who's standing near me, next to me, and I'll introduce him shortly. But I may just say a few words about why we actually gather on this occasion. You may know that the Battle for Australia Committee is primarily responsible for organising the Battle for Australia ceremony, an annual event that occurs on the first Wednesday in September each year. It's an event that emerged out of the Australia Remembers campaign in 1995. Some of you may remember that. It was the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, and the governments partnered with RSLs and other community organisations to make sure that we remembered appropriately on that occasion. Out of that emerged a group that was interested in a dedicated day that recognised what threat Australia had faced in those dark years, 1942 through 1945. And so in the late 90s, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, committees emerged, Battle for Australia committees. And in 2008, the day was actually gazetted as a day of national commemoration. It's one of only 5 that Australia has. There are obvious ones like Anzac Day and Remembrance Day. Battle for Australia joins that select list. And so each year the ceremony is held on the 2nd of September. This year it will be. But what are we saying when we say Battle for Australia? And without prejudicing too much of what you might be bringing to us today, John, or you can countermand anything I've said, what we've sought to do is to recognise when that unique phrase was coined. It was coined by Prime Minister Curtin at a crucial time in Australia's history. Singapore had fallen, in fact the anniversary is tomorrow. Timor had fallen to invading forces. There are atrocities occurring to our near north. There are incursions eventually in Darwin and in Sydney Harbour right here, but all up and down the east coast and northwest of Australia. And there were fierce battles ahead around Papua New Guinea and in the oceans adjacent. And so out of all of that, what occurred was that John Curtin issued a statement after the fall of Singapore in which he coined the phrase that we are now in a battle for Australia. And the following day at Martin Place, at the Cenotaph, a war rally was held to raise money for the fight that was ahead. And that was done at the site at which we conduct our Battle for Australia ceremony. So you can see the connections that have been developed over the years as a committee such as ours that we've inherited the legacy for continues to recognise all that was going on at that time. And so we've introduced this lecture series around the day in which John Curtin first articulated the phrase Battle for Australia, which in fact was the 16th of February, but we try for the nearest Friday. So today, in a series of lectures that we've been able to bring to you, we've got Dr John Edwards. He's a Senior Fellow at the Lowy Institute and an Adjunct Professor with the John Curtin Institute of Public Policy at Curtin University. You'll see too from him being an author of a 2-volume biography of John Curtin that he's probably Australia's resident expert on John Curtin. But in fact, in his daily life, John is an economist and writer. His work has taken him across Asia, America, all parts of Australia. He's advised governments and prime ministers, commercial banks and the Reserve Bank. In a unique situation that not many of us find ourselves, he's been a journalist for Fairfax, Murdoch and Packer, and somehow balanced that neat little trick. Along the way, written 6 books. One that I certainly became acquainted with when I was younger, called Keating, The Inside Story, having served Prime Minister Keating in earlier days. And of course the 2-volume biography that I mentioned earlier, John Curtin's War, it's called. And in 2018, one of those volumes was awarded the Prime Minister's Prize for Literature and History. So we're very eager to hear John present to us today, and his title is Prime Minister Curtin's Battle for Australia, the Politics and Strategy Behind a Phrase. Could you please welcome John Edwards?
Thanks indeed, Darren, for that very kind introduction. I don't know whether you were listening around Christmas. The end of last year, there was a ABC radio series about the myths of war. I think there were 4 programs. I heard one which was about Changi, the prison camp in Singapore where the 8th Division was marched after the surrender. Well, it was a very interesting program, and according to it, Changi was not so bad, or at least not so bad compared to working on the railway. And then another program they had, which I didn't catch, was about the battle for Australia. And I know they asked the question, well, was there one? Was there ever a battle for Australia? And the question posed was whether the Japanese planned to invade Australia in 1942. It's the same question that the historian Peter Stanley posed in a very, very good paper about a decade ago for the Australian War Memorial. And the quite clear answer about Japan's intentions, whether it planned to invade Australia, the quite clear answer is no, it did not. And I suppose I could cease the lecture at this point and we could have some more tea. But it's a more complicated story, I think. If we take the idea of the Battle of Australia only to mean did Japan plan to invade in 1942, and we answer no, it did not, it might follow that John Curtin didn't save Australia. The return of the 7th and the 6th and eventually the 9th Divisions didn't save Australia, and Douglas MacArthur didn't save Australia. The Coral Sea Battle or Midway didn't save Australia in 1942 because there was no invasion from which to save it, and none planned. Or does that follow? I think that's something we need to think about. Stanley's paper went on to criticise John Curtin, continuing to warn of a threat of invasion long after the threat had passed. So this morning I want to have another look at the Battle for Australia, of which Curtin warned repeatedly in the first 2 or 3 months after Pearl Harbor. I want to ask whether, in the light of what they then knew, Curtin and his military advisers acted reasonably and prudently, or did they panic? Did they panic? Was Australia in a panic at that point, as Churchill and Roosevelt were told, and I think believed? And then I want to have another look at this question of Japan's intentions and what we now know. We might ask whether the term battle for Australia is too narrowly construed if we mean only an invasion of the mainland. We could take the battle for Australia to reference a battle to preserve Australia's sovereignty and freedom of action. That would give us a very different slant on the debate. There were lesser contingencies. For example, it would have been awkward, including the occupation of Darwin and its use as a forward airbase to harass Allied efforts. or there is the possibility that Japan might well have, at least for a while, carried out what we know was the plan, which was to occupy Port Moresby, the Solomons, Fiji, Samoa, and make air and sea communications with the US difficult. I think that's another aspect of the battle for Australia we need to think about. Then I want to ask whether Curtin did indeed continue to warn of invasion long after it was no longer a practical possibility, and if he did, why he did. And then finally, at this time, I'd like to just briefly revisit what we learned in 1942 from a battle that never actually took place. What we learnt might be relevant to us now. We might ask, for example, why Australia was so little prepared for the contingency of invasion in 1942. And if we do, that'll take us back to the strategic debates in Australia from 1905 onwards. In fact, I'd argue that the notion of a battle for Australia is still important in defence planning today. It bears today on the nature of our security alliances, it bears on the structure of our defence forces, it bears on contemporary doctrine and capabilities. It's the oldest and most inescapable issue in Australian defence planning because it's basically all about the defence of Australian territory, the most fundamental duty of any national military force and of any national government. We're an island nation. We spend a vast amount on submarines. One of their essential roles is to complicate the planning of any power thinking of establishing a military force on Australian soil. So too, this consideration influences our choice of warplanes, or should. We value a security alliance with the US, which explicitly provides that the parties will consult if there's an attack on the forces of either in the Pacific region. This notion, the battle for Australia, a battle which we can agree was not fought, is for all that of immense importance. So let's begin by recalling the circumstances of February and March 1942 when the Japanese invasion threat was perceived to be most grave. And let's ponder whether the Australian leadership at that point responded with good sense or did it panic. Of course, a war with Japan had been a staple of Australian defence planning for decades prior to 1942. Hours after the news of Pearl Harbor, Australia's political and military leaders were concerned by the possibility of a Japanese invasion of mainland Australia. Rallying the country on Monday, 8th of December, Curtin promised that Australians would hold this country and keep it as a citadel for the British-speaking race and as a place where civilisation will persist. That implies, to my mind, the possibility of an attack on Australia which would be resisted. By Tuesday, the following day, he was more explicit, telling War Cabinet that Australia must be prepared to resist invasion. The Australian Chiefs of Staff did not at first see it quite like that, but encouraged by the Secretary of the Department of Defence Coordination, Fred Shedden, they soon changed their minds. And by Thursday of that week, this is the week following Pearl Harbor, the Australian Chiefs presented to War Cabinet an evaluation that the attack on Malaya might well be a first step in a Japanese plan for a major attack on Australia. If they thought that in the first week of the Pacific War, they had no reason to change their mind in subsequent weeks. Hong Kong fell, American and Filipino forces retreated in the Philippines, Japanese forces advanced rapidly down the Malay Peninsula towards Singapore. The Japanese had captured Rabaul by the end of January. They captured Singapore in mid-February. They had captured Timor and landed on the northeastern coast of New Guinea. In late February, they invaded Java and captured it too. By the end of February, European colonial power in the Western Pacific had disappeared. Australia's invasion warnings became more urgent and more explicit. When Japanese forces took Rabaul on January 23, 1942, the first Australian territory to be invaded and the first time Australian militia troops had been under fire, Deputy Prime Minister Frank Ford publicly declared that I am certain the enemy will make an attack, meaning an attack on Australia. War Cabinet let it be known that it had decided the country would be burnt before the advancing Japanese. As Darren reminded us, Curtin declared the battle for Australia had begun as soon as Singapore fell on February 15. The fall of Singapore was Australia's Dunkirk, he claimed the following day, and just as the evacuation of Dunkirk initiated the battle for Britain, so too the fall of Singapore opens the battle for Australia. The service chiefs and Curtin, the political leadership, had every reason for concern. By early March 1942, 100 days after the Pacific War began, Australia's circumstances were far more dire than in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. When Japan went to war in the Pacific, Australia's home defences were feeble. 3 divisions were in the Middle East and another in Malaya, but in Australia there was very little. Fred Shedden told War Cabinet soon after Pearl Harbor that the Army could hardly put a single trained division into the field in Australia. Australia had little artillery, only a few tanks, few fighters and bombers. By March, Australia had several 100,000 troops in training, but had already lost almost all the trained troops fighting the Japanese advance. In many respects, Australia's circumstances were worse than those of Britain in May 1941. By early March 1942 and on Curtin's watch, Australia had lost over 20,000 men in the Pacific War. They were not glorious defeats like Gallipoli or Dunkirk. The defeated units couldn't be evacuated. The survivors mostly surrendered and were taken prisoner or in some cases executed. The losses in the Pacific War in just those few months were far greater than Australia had lost in over 2 years of fighting in the Middle East, far more than it lost in the disaster of the Greeks campaign. In February, Australia had lost the entire 8th Division in Singapore. It then lost 3,000 men, part of the returning 7th, in Java. It lost troops in Rabaul, New Ireland, Ambon and Timor. It lost the naval ships Perth and Yarra and their crews in battles with the Japanese Navy. Curtin, his ministers, his advisers all judged that Australia itself was under serious threat of invasion. In late February 1942, the Chiefs of Staff told him that Japan was at liberty to invade Australia if it so desired. Major General Gordon Bennett, the former commander of the 8th Division, who had escaped from Singapore, said publicly in early March that he thought an invasion likely. He thought the Japanese would begin in the north of Australia and proceed airfield by airfield south, as they had in Malaya. Former Prime Minister Billy Hughes, then leading the opposition United Australia Party, a member of the Advisory War Council and presumed to be in the know, publicly agreed with Bennett. He said an invasion was certain. Civilians were being evacuated from Darwin and from northern Queensland. Darwin was being bombed, Broome, Wyndham and Derby were bombed. At the end of February, Australians were told that War Cabinet, meeting at Victoria Barracks in Melbourne, had been discussing plans for defending the country against invasion. War Cabinet, as I mentioned, had already instructed that if Japan invaded, crops, stores and factories were to be burnt as the Australian defenders fell back. Signposts that might have helped the enemy were removed. Barbed wire was strung across some Australian beaches. There were slit trenches then in public parks. War Cabinet ordered that the windows of its room in Victoria Barracks be bricked up against air raids. Curtin must have thought about invasion a good deal in those days in March 1942. It was a time of great uncertainty. The Allies didn't have the ships and planes in the southwest Pacific to monitor all Japanese deployments. Sitting at the Speaker's table in the House of Representatives or around the Great Table in the War Cabinet room down at Victoria Barracks, Curtin would have thought that at any moment he might be handed a note telling him that a Japanese force had actually landed. Australia's coastline was too immense, Allied reconnaissance too little, for Australia and his advisers to have any assurance that they would know about a landing before it occurs. Curtin would have had to have thought about the broadcast he would have to make, the plans to protect his government. He would perhaps have thought of his personal safety. He would have thought of the personal safety of his family in Cottesloe, the beach suburb near Perth, and on the other side of the continent from Melbourne and Canberra. Invasion was certainly on the minds of Curtin's fellow Australians. In Malaya, the Japanese had used small boats to outflank the defending Empire troops. Australian authorities now required owners of small boats to report their positions. The authorities announced plans to drive cattle and sheep and horses inland to deny them to the invaders. In early March, the Minister for Home Security, Bert Lazzarini, issued a booklet telling civilians what to do in case of invasion. Australians were told to stand firm, to carry on, to obey orders instantly. They were told how to disable a motorcycle, a car or a lorry so the Japanese couldn't use them. They were urged to stay where they lived and not clog the road as refugees. Do not tell the enemy anything, Lazzarini told Australians. Do not give him anything, do not help him in any way. In a leader on March 7, 1942, the Sydney Morning Herald declared that the shadow of invasion is falling across the land. Well, we have to ask ourselves now whether that alarm was unfounded, whether it was panic rather than a cool calculation of the odds. We need to bear in mind that in March 1942 there was no longer any friendly force between Australia and Japanese forces, except that isolated and battle force of American and Filipino troops on the Bataan Peninsula. Roosevelt had formally told Churchill in mid-February that America accepted responsibility for the defence of Australia. But while America was responsible, the battleships of its Pacific Fleet had been sunk in Pearl Harbor. There were a few thousand American servicemen in Australia, mostly sent earlier to staff the air route to support the Americans in the Philippines. I think we can now agree, perhaps, that knowing what they then knew, Curtin and his advisers were right to be concerned, to warn, right to do whatever they could to prepare the country to resist invasion. But why was the country so unprepared? That's part of a broader issue of the battle for Australia, to which I want to briefly return. But before coming to that, I wanted to ponder the question of Japanese plans. We now know that Japan did not plan to invade Australia. But the idea of an invasion was not entirely far-fetched. We know that it was under active discussion in Tokyo and that plans were agreed to render Australia helpless. We know now that in March 1942, the planning staff of the Japanese Navy was then pressing hard for an invasion of Australia. In contrast to their objective of seizing the oil of the Netherlands East Indies and the rubber of Malaya, they were not particularly interested in Australia's resources, such as they were. The Navy instead argued that Americans would use Australia as a base to block further Japanese advances and to later launch a counterattack. If Japanese forces could control the northern half of Australia, they could use air power to protect their hold on New Guinea, which in turn protected Rabaul and further back the Marianas. The logic of the war was to win air bases, each, in the Japanese case, further south or further east of the one before. While Curtin and his War Cabinet met in Melbourne in early March to plan Australia's defence, officers of the Japanese Navy and Army were meeting in Tokyo to discuss precisely the issue of an invasion of Australia. The Japanese Army argued it had higher priorities. It argued that a successful invasion would take millions of tonnes of shipping and several months' preparation. By the end of March 1942, the Navy staff reluctantly conceded. They agreed instead to isolate Australia from the United States. That would make it difficult to use Australia as an Allied base. Japan could perhaps take Australia later, if necessary. It might be useful, some Japanese strategists argued, to hold Australia hostage to a negotiated settlement of the Pacific War. So Japan adopted a policy of isolating Australia. Port Moresby was to be occupied on 7th of May 1942, Midway on 7th of June, New Caledonia on the 8th of July, Fiji on the 18th of July, and Samoa on the 21st of July. And we need to bear in mind that hitherto Japan had had no difficulty in meeting its schedules. Had it not been for the decision of the US Navy to risk 2 of its 3 remaining Pacific carriers in a Coral Sea battle in May, that Japanese plan might well have succeeded, at least for a time. So I think we can conclude from that recollection of Japanese plans that while it did not, in February and March, plan for an invasion of Australia, it did plan for everything short of an invasion of Australia, and might well have succeeded had it not been for the timeliness of and success of the American intervention in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Well then, what about the last question that was raised by Peter Stanley? Did Curtin unwisely warn of the threat of invasion long after it had passed? It was well into 1943 before Curtin publicly declared that an invasion of Australia was no longer a threat. This was long after the Battle of the Coral Sea, long after Midway, after Guadalcanal, long after the Kokoda battles and the Milne Bay battle, long after the recapture of Buna and Gona. US power in the Pacific was clearly preponderant and becoming overwhelming, long before Curtin admitted that an invasion of Australia by Japan was no longer a threat. Well, I personally have little doubt that after Midway, Curtin judged that an invasion was unlikely. MacArthur, anyway, had told Curtin soon after the Coral Sea battle in May 1942 that it removed any immediate threat to Australia and that Japan would have abandoned, for the time being, any plan to invade Australia if it had one. Midway followed a month later and would presumably have reinforced MacArthur's conviction. Japan in that battle lost 4 of its big carriers and lost the easy control of the sea and air in the southwest Pacific, which would have been required to invade Australia in force. Well, I think there are probably 2 reasons Curtin persisted with warning about invasion. One was that right through to mid-August, the mid-August 1943 election, his government depended on 2 independents in the House and did not control the Senate. It was a minority government. To exert political control, to minimise disputes and opposition, Curtin kept attention on the possibility of an attack. The notion of a growing threat to Australia from Japan had been a theme of Curtin's election campaigns in 1937 and 1940. It wasn't until the 1943 election, or just prior to it, that he conceded the invasion threat had passed, and of course, in that election campaign, claimed some credit for the removal of that threat. But there was perhaps another reason too for Curtin persisting with the claim that an invasion was a possibility. A more important reason. Pressed by MacArthur, he ceaselessly sought more resources for the Pacific War. He resented the Germany First strategy and the allocation of air power and shipping to the war against Germany. He knew that the war against Japan was supposed to be defensive in the Allied leadership framework until such time as the war in Europe was won. Both he and MacArthur responded to this directive by demanding resources for the defence of Australia. In fighting in New Guinea, for example, which was undoubtedly offensive rather than defensive, MacArthur claimed to be defending Australia. MacArthur told Curtin at a meeting on June 1, 1942, that when he, Curtin, appealed to Roosevelt and Churchill for more resources for the South West Pacific Theatre, he should not put those claims in terms of those required for offensive action, but, quote, for those necessary to ensure the security of Australia by adequate defence. This, of course, meant persisting with the invasion story, though both Curtin and MacArthur would soon think it unlikely. So Stanley is right to point out that Curtin continued to warn of invasion long after it had ceased to be possible. He was right to correct the legend. But I cannot find fault with Curtin's misrepresentations. They did no harm, perhaps they did a little good. In England, Churchill was similarly warning of an invasion threat long after Germany turned its attention elsewhere, and Churchill was doing it for similar reasons. Well, let me say a few words finally about why Australia was so unprepared to resist an attack in early 1942 if one had come. It's a familiar story, but one we need to be reminded of every now and then. It was a debate summarised by Curtin in a wonderful, almost clairvoyant speech he made about the Singapore strategy in the House of Representatives in 1936. Australia thought of itself as a European nation, or rather an English nation, in possession of a vast, rich landmass in a part of the world crowded with poor people, culturally and ethnically very different from themselves, people who might want to take the place of Australians. Japan's victory in the war with Russia in 1905 pleased the UK. Russia was a strategic opponent. Japan would soon be a British ally. But it didn't please Australians. Defence Minister George Pearce immediately identified Japan as Australia's likely enemy, a hostile power capable of invading Australia and taking control of its spaces and resources. But defining Japan as the enemy did not in those days of great naval surface fleets, of very limited air power, define the nature of Australia's defensive response. It was complicated too by the cultural attitudes of Australians. They thought of themselves as British. They thought of the UK as home. They had no independent foreign service. So despite Pearce's reservations, despite the opposing views of some army commanders, Australia's defence strategy was arranged around the Royal Navy. Australia would contribute its Navy to the Royal Navy Command. It would recruit expeditionary land forces to fight under British command in Europe and the Middle East. In return, the Royal Navy would defend Australia against invasion by a hostile power. This then evolved into the Singapore strategy, where the UK would build a naval base to accommodate a fleet if it was necessary to dispatch one to defend its Eastern Empire or the dominions of Australia and New Zealand. If there was a battle for Australia, it would be fought at sea, a long way from Australia's shores, and by a British fleet. It followed that Australia didn't need an independent defence strategy. It didn't need an army or an air force that could be deployed to defend Australia. This was the blue water strategy. The implication was that Australian forces would be drawn into the defence of the UK. That didn't stop the Army Command, the Australian Army Command, thinking about invasion and thinking about how the army should be deployed if an invasion occurred. Thus, from quite early on in Australian Army thinking, a Brisbane Line or Bundaberg Line strategy emerged for fighting the battle for Australia. Colonel Winter had long argued this position. Red Robbie Robertson argued it publicly in 1934, but it had long been part of Army thinking. Laverack was a proponent. They argued that if the UK was fighting Germany, it would not be able to spare a fleet to deter Japan. The Army view was relevant only if an enemy reached Australia, so it was not inconsistent with a blue water strategy or later with a forward land defence strategy in Malaya and in the islands of Australia's north. But it did require a home army with transport and artillery. It required support from fighters and bombers. Following the Allied victory in World War I, a defence strategy, a battle for Australia strategy, which depended on a superior British fleet, was plausible. The UK was a victor in the Great War. Germany was prostrate. Japan was becoming a serious naval power, but it was an ally of the UK. By the mid-30s, it was evident that Germany was rearming. It was also evident that Japan was building an empire in the East. It became evident that the UK could not both defend itself against Germany and defend its Eastern Empire and dominions against Japan. That was the point of Curtin's 1936 speech repudiating the Singapore strategy. The apogee, or perhaps the nadir, of the Singapore strategy became apparent during a meeting in Melbourne on the 12th of June 1940. A year and a half, let's say, before Japan struck south. The meeting in June 1940 was held as France fell. Australia then had a home army of 130,000 militia. Pressed by the newly appointed information coordinator, Sir Keith Murdoch, as to whether Australia would fight an invasion, the Home Defence Commander, General Brudenell White, told him that guns and ammunition for Australia's home defence would not last over a month's fighting. In any case, White went on, assuming the Royal Navy was unable to help, even if we were able to defend ourselves against invasion, Japan within 6 months could probably subdue us by action at sea. Murdoch, Menzies, Prime Minister Menzies, who was also at that meeting, might have concluded that Australia needed more guns, more ammunition, more war supplies of all kinds. Instead, Murdoch concluded that there's no possible need in this country for more than 130,000 trained men. White told him he would have to be careful of using that. To Murdoch's question of whether White planned to fight an invasion, the roundabout answer appeared to be no. A week later, White told War Cabinet, with no objection from Menzies, that if British naval forces in the region were knocked out, Japan could bring the Commonwealth to terms by the exercise of sea power alone without the need for invasion. That's the background to Australia's unpreparedness in 1942. The lesson is a simple one. It's good to have friends, to have alliances. If you get into trouble, then at a minimum, it complicates an opponent's planning. And in the meantime, there are advantages of intelligence sharing and, in the case of the US, defence technology transfers. But we also discovered in February and March 1942 that we cannot rely on alliances in any circumstances in which our national interests diverge from those of our ally. That was the story of Australia and Britain in the Pacific War. In supporting our ally, we failed to provide for our own defence. That was a colossal mistake, one that might have had far more serious outcomes than it did. We should always be on our guard to avoid making that mistake again. Thank you.